All right. All right, we're talking about the federal minimum wage, and most of my arguments can just be applied to any minimum wage, but I have a couple that are specific to the federal minimum wage, so I'm going to start with those. One, there's no authority in the Constitution for a federal minimum wage. Um, the courts have actually already ruled against the minimum wage three different times, at least in our history. Also, the federal minimum wage is kind of redundant and unnecessary since the state and local governments set their own minimum wages, and they can do it much more effectively than the feds can because they actually know about their own economy. When you have a country as big as the U.S. and cost of living oddly diverse, there's just no way to have one minimum wage that will work for everybody. So I think we should just not have a federal minimum wage at all, and just let the states and cities take care of it. So what Michael's going to have to do in this debate is convince us that the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour right now. He's going to have to convince us that essentially the benevolent act of giving someone a job for $7.24 an hour should be illegal, and I think that's going to be a hard sell. Because generally, it's kind of like a given that when two consenting adults have an agreement, the federal government should just stay out of it. But we already use this reasoning in things like in our opposition against like sodomy laws, right? That's the whole argument. It's consenting adults, the government should not be regulating their behavior. And if you use the same reasoning towards the minimum wage, you'll come to the same conclusion. So I just want to start with a few questions for you. One, what is the purpose of the federal minimum wage? What do you think what purpose does it serve? What do you think it should be at? And if it's higher than what you think employers are willing to pay on their own, where do you think that extra money comes from?
All right. So made some excellent points. Before I address those, I'm going to go ahead and start with a brief overview of my argument for the minimum wage. My argument for the minimum wage stems from my same argument for safety regulations within factories and any similar regulation that the federal government maintains as a minimum set of standards to ensure the safety and well-being of the population, which we can all agree is the federal government's main job. So based on that, I want to talk about your first question. What is the purpose of the federal minimum wage? The purpose of the federal minimum wage is to ensure that those that are working are provided with the minimum wage necessary in order to live a safe, healthy, and productive life. You make the argument that how is it that the federal minimum wage is better than the state and local governmental minimum wage? The thing about the federal government is it's never going to override a state and local government in the negative for the employee. State and local governments are free to make their minimum wages higher if they deem it necessary than the federal minimum wage. But the federal minimum wage is to ensure that regardless of who's in power in the state or in the local government, those minimum wages are set at the minimum that they have determined will provide at least an opportunity for a safe and productive life for their population. This is the same as any governmental regulations that says this is the bare minimum that we think is safe for our population. Anything below this is unsafe. That's going to apply to any sort of safety regulation. It's going to apply to minimum wage. You argue that the United States government has no authority in the Constitution for a federal minimum wage. I would argue that is not true, considering that the federal minimum wage exists, considering that it still exists, and I assume that people have argued against it since the beginning, especially all employers. If it was illegal or if it was unconstitutional, it would have been eliminated by now. So evidence suggests that, as what you're saying, that it is no authority in the Constitution. Obviously, it does, considering that it exists. Now, your second question, I didn't quite get that, so if you give it to me again, I don't mind answering it on my next turn, but you can address what I've said so far. I'm going to pass the mic.
Okay, you said you compared these two safety regulations. I think we both agree that safety is more important than someone's wage, and I think you said that anything below the minimum wage is unsafe. You do realize that unpaid internships are legal, and that's what's kind of more of a reason why the minimum wage is nonsense, because you can legally have somebody work for you for free, and then giving that same person $7 an hour is illegal. But you can have the same person do the same work and pay them nothing, and that's perfectly legal for some reason. People would say that, I don't know, I guess you could say you should just ban unpaid internships, but I think that would just exacerbate the problem that minimum wage laws already create. So if the government thought it was unsafe to make less than the minimum wage, and they wouldn't have unpaid interns be legal. Now, yeah, the idea that everything that exists is constitutional, that kind of just undermines the entire concept. The minimum wage didn't exist before what, 1938 or so. So the Constitution was written in the 18th century, and so there was a time you could make the argument, oh, it didn't exist. So it's you can make the same argument the other way. When it didn't exist, is what I'm saying. And like I said, the courts have already struck this down. So the 10th Amendment says anything that's not expressly given power to the federal government is left for the states or the people. But I don't want to spend too much time on that. So I noticed you didn't give a price for the minimum wage, and that's because how could you? There's no way to know what the minimum level to have a safe and healthy and productive life, I think. There's no way to know what that is. The market sets prices for a reason, because any bureaucrats aren't a substitute for the information that you get from the collective information from millions of people making decisions in a market. Only the market can tell you what the price is. And if the market tells you, everybody has a minimum wage. It's for each individual person. But if your minimum wage is below the arbitrary number that the Fed set, then guess what? Your actual minimum wage now is zero. The real minimum wage is zero, although you're not guaranteed to a job. And that's one of the major problems with the minimum wage, and I'll go into that to come.
All right, you made a couple excellent points, and I'll try to reach all of them. You said that the idea of an unpaid internship undermines the idea of a minimum wage because the government allows for a certain percentage of individuals to work for an unpaid internship. Now, the idea of an unpaid internship is not to work a job, it is to learn a skill set. I think we can agree on that. Now, unpaid interns are often abused and misused, but then I assume there's certain rules or regulations on how companies are allowed to, how many unpaid interns they have and what they're allowed to do with them. If you have an unpaid intern, there are definitely rules that you have to follow for them. Whether or not those rules are actually followed, I don't know. I'm going to assume probably not. But unpaid internships are a special class of employment because they have a special purpose, which is to gain a set of skills. I don't think unpaid internships in and of themselves, given that there's such a small percentage of the total total percentage of employment, I don't think they undermine the idea of a minimum wage. But I am for having unpaid internships being abolished because, like you said, they are an abuse to the students that are doing them, or to the newly graduated new workers. You asked me what I think the reasonable minimum wage is, and that only a free market can determine what the minimum wage is. I think that that's a bit much. You're already granting that the correct minimum wage for a particular area can be determined. If you think that the minimum wage for a particular area can be determined, say, by the market, then it definitely could be determined by governmental analysts that could say that in every market across the United States, wages below X number are unacceptable because they don't provide the employee with a certain needs that they have. So I think we can come across that federal minimum wage that says that everyone in the federation or everyone in the country needs to be paid if they're working at least this minimum. They've done that. They've established what the minimum wage is. People think the minimum wage needs to be increased. There's arguments for and against that. However, no one is arguing that the minimum wage cannot be determined. It most certainly can. You started your response to saying that safety is more important than a minimum wage. I'm not sure I see how being able to afford to eat, be able to afford your rent, being able to afford health care, afford to provide for yourself and for your family is less important than your personal safety. One is going to be important on the day-to-day. Another is going to be important over the course of your whole employment and course of your life. So I don't see those as being distinct, safety and being able to provide at least a minimum for yourself and for your family. I'm going to pass it back to you. I guess 4 seconds.
I'm sorry, I don't know if you misunderstood me. I did not concede that the minimum wage, okay, the minimum wage can be determined by the market, but nobody knows what that wage is, and it's different for every person. And that reminds me, you said something that we could, in your first round that I didn't respond to, that we can agree that the government its job is to keep people's safe or something, or provide for their safety and well-being or something like that. Yeah, I wouldn't agree with that. I think the job of the government is primarily to protect our rights. But just get that out of the way. So yeah, the minimum wage. So even in an area where the cost of living, you can put a value on the cost of living. Even in that situation, every individual person has like extremely different expenses and different needs and different income requirements for what they're dealing with. So there is no way to have one minimum wage. You may be able to determine it individually, be like, I need this much money to eat and all that. But you mentioned rent and food and healthcare. The minimum wage doesn't ensure any of those things. Like I said, the actual practical minimum wage is zero. The minimum wage is nothing more than a price control on labor, and we should have learned this, in our Econ 101 course in college. And unfortunately, we learned this the hard way in the 70s, that price controls are subject to causing surpluses and shortages. And in this case, it's a surplus. Well, if it's set above the equilibrium price, it's a surplus in labor in the form of unemployment. And that's one of probably the biggest problem with the minimum wage. It hurts the very, very poorest people among us, the people with the lowest skills, the people that get priced out of the market. Or if you mentioned the unpaid internships are to get skills, that's usually what your first job is for. Unfortunately, with the minimum wage laws, you have a big hurdle to get over for your first job, and that's why there's a positive correlation with youth unemployment and minimum wage. So the higher the minimum wage, the higher the youth unemployment. I was wondering if you've seen The Pursuit of Happiness. It's a really great movie. Will Smith, he actually was as poor can be, homeless, and he did an unpaid internship. And I don't know, he's rich now. It's a great movie. You should watch it. Anyways, I'm wondering where he'd be with that unpaid internship, which you seem to think is immoral. But then it goes back to agreements between consensual adults, which are really none of our business, much less the feds.
Okay, quick question here. Do you think it's any business of the federal government if a person agrees to work in an unsafe factory where they're more likely than usual to be injured or killed? I'll ask you that question, and you can pass it back.
I'm not addressing safety regulations here. I disagree with you that those are even comparable. I think those are completely separate. Safety is much more important than someone's wage. But I'm just talking about wages.
Okay, I don't seem to see those as distinct, but we can go from there. You said the job of the government is not to protect people's safety, but to protect their rights. I assume their rights to being treated fairly, their rights to having access to food, having access to shelter, having access to amenities, having access to education. Those are things that the government should protect. We know from history that if not forced to pay workers a minimum wage, companies will pay workers as low as possible, and any skilled worker will be replaced by, say, a less skilled worker, or just until you hit the equilibrium to what is being produced and what is not. We know now that the average worker is more productive than in the past, and yet their wages have not gone up. So we also know that the youth unemployment in the United States is 10%. So we know that today's minimum wage of the $7.25 does not impact youth unemployment as negatively as you might seem to imply. There are much higher degrees of youth unemployment in unregulated countries. I think Bosnia is one. Some different other most of the UK that doesn't have a regulated minimum wage. Their unemployment is much higher among youth because, like you said, it's hard for why would companies hire individuals with no skill if they can hire slightly older individuals that do have some sort of skill. So you have people that work in the same job for low wages for their whole life, and then you have your young employees, potential employees, not being hired because there's already people working for low wages in non-regulated countries. So anyway, I'm going to go back and I'm going to stress I don't see how you can say that it's not related or at least comparable to say that guaranteeing that somebody gets compensated at least a minimum amount. The government can determine minimums for all sorts of things. We know it's like saying that the minimum blood alcohol content to give somebody a speeding ticket or a drunk driving ticket there shouldn't be a minimum because it's different for every person. I mean, of course, that's absurd. You can guarantee a minimum for everyone that says whatever quality we're talking about, whatever statistic we're trying to talk about, we can say that anything below this is universally bad. I mean, that happens all the time. We do that all the time. And of course, the government's going to be the best one to determine that.
Okay, I'm going to work backwards on these points. Okay, so yeah, you can't determine someone's minimum wage. So like, I mean, like the single mother of four, it can't be comparable to the high school kid living with his parents, and yet they're operating under the same law, probably making the same wage in many cases. So you simply can't. That everybody has different deals, and if you're living with your parents, you basically have no expenses. But the single mom of four is basically on her own with a ton of expenses. You said that it won't youth unemployment isn't affected as negatively as I might think. Well, it's easy to say sitting back, me and you saying that, but if you're the person that is affecting, if you're the person that is priced out of the market, it's quite devastating for that person. You mentioned that they'll pay as low as possible. Employers paying as low as possible. That's probably true, but it's only so possible to. Well, for one, there's a lot of low-skilled jobs that pay more than the minimum wage. So the fact that the people paying over the minimum wage would say that that's not true. But unless you're saying it as low as possible, which, in a market where there's certain prices, then yeah, it's as low as possible. The price is still reasonable compared to, with other factors. If that makes any sense. Now, as far as your rights, saying right to food or right to this, right to that, those aren't rights, because if you say food and stuff is a right, then by not feeding me, my rights are being violated right now. And if you're going to say that's a right, then okay, anything that has to be given to you can't be a right, because you have to coerce people's labor to produce things. Like, rights are things that basically those are what's called positive rights, and that would be interesting to have a whole nother debate on positive rights versus negative rights. But I think positive rights are more bunk than even the minimum wage is. But we should save that for another debate. I can't read my handwriting here, so I can't respond to that. I have 30 seconds. Let me check my notes. Another thing. So whenever you regulate things and tax things, it creates black markets. So there's probably a lot of people that are making below the minimum wage. Actually, studies show us there are people making below the minimum wage. They're working off the books, and because of this, they're not paying any payroll taxes. And our Social Security and Medicare could probably use those payroll taxes right now. Did I make this debate for an hour? How much time do we have? It says 18. I think I made this for an hour.
Yeah, I think you did. I'm cool with that, or we can stop whenever you your say. All right, good. I think we're making some progress here. I'm going to provide a scenario that I think you can agree with you, and then we can discuss it or not as you see fit. I'm thinking of a situation where you have a small town that's built around a factory where the primary source of jobs in an area is, say, a large factory. These factory towns happen all over. When the factory closes, the town goes dead because there's no one there to work. When you have a single large employer that employs most people, and when someone's looking for a job, they have no alternative to work in an area. Now, when you have something like a factory where low skill is, I don't want to say the factory workers are low skilled, but you don't need a high degree of skill in order to be able to function competently inside the factory. So when there are so many people in a town that need a job and there's one employer, the employer has no incentive in order to raise up or award people for experience. They can say, here's the wage. If the minimum wage didn't exist, they would say, here is a low wage, take it or leave it. If you don't want it, somebody else is going to come in and get it. If you don't take the minimum or the low wage that the company is offering, there's no other option for you to go in certain areas. So for those people, it seems clear to me that a minimum wage should come in and should be stepped in. The federal government will come in and say, no, these people, they deserve our protection because they're Americans. The government's job, whether or not you agree with it, in my opinion, the government's job is to protect the rights and the rights of the people, to provide for their safety, provide for their well-being. So when a company is taking advantage of a particular situation, then the federal government should come in and regulate it. If you can agree that in that situation, when a company is obviously taking advantage of a certain situation, if you can agree that in that case, there should be a mandated minimum wage by the state, local, or federal government, then you must see where there's a minimum wage that should be mandated by the federal government for everyone. Because if there's a certain situation where, this employer is going to take advantage of the situation, well, every employer is going to take advantage of the situation. So in every case, you're going to have employers trying to pay employees as little as possible to get the most good. They're going to try to find that balance. That's how businesses work. That's how we make our money, is by trying to have the lowest cost to produce the most goods. So do you deny that in the situation that I'm describing, that a federal minimum wage should be the best course of action? If you do, I'd love to talk about it. If not, we can move on to something else.
Yeah, of course I deny that. That's not my biggest complaint with top-down policies like this. They take one situation and then they'll regulate an entire economy based on this one thing that happens in maybe one industry. It's bad because regulations and things like this have unintended consequences, and everybody suffers from these unintended consequences. To fix one problem employers will pay as little as possible, and workers will get as much as possible. I mean, employees try to do the least amount of work for the most amount of money. Employers try to pay the least for the most amount of work. They're always going to be at odds. But the idea that employers just pay the minimum, it's just not true. Like for example, Henry Ford, long before the minimum wage laws, paid his workers very well, and those were very low-skilled workers. Those are assembly line workers where you just do one thing over and over and over. It didn't take much skill at all, and he paid very well. You mentioned where people have no other option to work. There's lots of stories of, especially in like California where they're jacking their minimum wage up to 15 an hour. There's a lot of stories of businesses having to close down largely because of uh, the minimum wage hikes. And in those cases, you're actually creating, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. In those cases, you're not going to have as much options to go to other places. Sorry, my daughter's training. Because people are closing down, then you have less options. And this is why regulations like this um, consolidate power into the largest corporations, because they can absorb these kinds of things, and mom and pops can't absorb these cost increases. So they go out of business, and then you got like the Walmarts of the world, you know, consolidating their monopolies, not really monopolies, but you know, close enough. And so it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like, oh, there aren't many options, so we're going to regulate, and then the regulation causes less options. Now, since we have an hour, I guess I could. We only have 30 seconds left. So I met this homeless guy who said he'd take a job for $3 to $5 an hour, and he's over $2 to $4 away from even being able to legally negotiate with an employer. And so I've heard it said that the minimum wage laws rebalance the negotiating power between low-skilled workers and employers. Well, in this case, it just completely eliminates any negotiating power. And so this is one of the guys that has that hurdle to deal with, and it's just unfortunate. There's no reason why he shouldn't get a job.
Okay, a couple of things. Let me just work down through those. One of the things that I like to do is to move away from ideals. I want to move away from, in an ideal society, X and works, and deal with what it actually is happening, to deal with reality. In reality, employers take advantage of their employees. Yes, employees, like you said, most certainly try to take advantage of their employers, but we've seen the case, it's been repeated, where employers do the least as possible, the cheapest thing to do to get the most production. They do this in safety, they do this in wages, they do it however they can. So when you're dealing with reality, there most certainly should be regulations. And one of the hard things that come about with reality is if you have a business that can't afford to pay its employees a living wage, can't afford to keep running if they're having to pay a minimum wage or even a higher minimum wage, well, then that business is only working because they're having what I believe is called a wage subsidy. They're only able to function because they're paying their workers so low wages. If that's true, then that business should not exist. It would not exist in a normal company or in a normal environment. So it doesn't exist. It shouldn't exist, because if they can't afford to pay their employees, they shouldn't exist. To say that because certain stores will shut down because of minimum wage hikes is not to say that stores that haven't shut down because of the minimum wage means that the minimum wage is bad. It just means that the stores and the businesses themselves are bad. You said that because the minimum wage takes away from employees' ability to negotiate, then they're not able to say we'll work for $5 an hour. Well, if you didn't have the minimum wage, what you would have is a rise of unions. I mean, you have either the minimum wage or you have a plethora of unions that negotiate for a minimum wage. So either way, either if you have a federal mandated minimum wage or you're part of a union, you're going to have a negotiated minimum wage. So in either case, you're going to have a minimum wage. So either case, the individual is not going to be negotiating for their own wage. So no individual goes into a company and negotiates for their own wage, at least in any unskilled individual. They're told what their wage is going to be. If they're unionized, their wage will be, there's a minimum wage. If they're not unionized, then the federal government sets a minimum wage. To come back to your story in 6 seconds, if that person the homeless guy worked for you for 2 hours, would you only pay him? Okay. What I was going to say is, if that homeless guy came and said, I want to work for $3 to $5 an hour, and he came and did $2 or $3 or 2 hours worth of work for you, would you pay him just $6 or pay them just $10? No, of course you wouldn't, because you would realize that the amount of work that he put in deserves more, deserves to be at a minimum higher than the $3 to $5. So, I mean, the idea that an individual's time and effort is worth more than $3 to $5 an hour is plain. I mean, I wouldn't, if someone came to me and said, I'm willing to work for $3 an hour, and I had them, clean up my yard for 5 hours, I'm not going to pay them $15, because I would know that what they did was not worth that. Even if they are willing to work, I would know that what they're doing is worth more than that, because an individual's time and effort, even if they don't understand it, has value. And so the federal government recognizes that, and they put a minimum value on effort. Whatever your effort is, whatever you're doing, the minimum value that it's worth is the $7.25 an hour. It can be worth more. People can pay you $1 million an hour if that's what they want, if they think your effort is worth that. But the government says your effort for what you do, no matter what it is $7.25 an hour is the minimum that you can do. And I think that's fair. I think you would think it was fair for an individual. I don't think it, but I mean, I guess there are people out there that if someone says I'm willing to work for $5 an hour and they work them for 5 hours, they only pay them the $25. I don't know anyone like that, but maybe there are people out there that would do
that. Yeah, to your story, people that would do that, it's certainly not fair that they're not legally able to do that. You said 7.25 is fair, but you're just going off of the current minimum wage. You declined to set your own minimum wage, and that goes back to economists, but that goes back to us not the minimum wage at the end of the day is arbitrary. It has to be. No, you said you wouldn't pay that person $15 for working, I don't know, a lot. I forget the actual numbers, but and you're right, you wouldn't. But there's a good reason why you wouldn't, because if you did, that person wouldn't come back, and that's why you don't pay that low, because it's not. Yeah, they wouldn't come back. And it's not necessarily true that it's not worth, someone working for $3 an hour. They work for 2 hours and you pay them $6. It's not worth their time. That's not necessarily true. It depends what they're doing. Lots of times people are just punching a clock. So there was a video shop in my hometown, and they were obviously not abiding by the law. They had every time I went in, there was like a middle schooler doing their homework or reading their book. I think they paid them $3 an hour at the time, is what I heard. And it was a video shop. It wasn't very busy, small video shop in a small town, and they're just sitting there reading a book. So yeah, it's definitely worth their time as a middle schooler. Of course, I guess that probably goes against child labor laws and minimum wage, but they still served a valuable service to the community. And you mentioned that if you can't pay your employees, you don't deserve to exist. It's not about the employees. Business exists to offer goods and services. That's what builds the economy. That's what raises our standard of living. Is because we have goods and services available to us, and hopefully they're affordable. And that goes back to the cost of production and if the wage is too high, it's going to push up the prices. But it's about serving the community with goods and services. You're beholden to your customers. You're not beholden to your workers. So it's weird that you're saying that if they can't pay their workers a living wage, then they shouldn't exist. I mean, you do realize that when a company closes down, whatever wages they were paying for their employees, their employees make nothing. So they're much worse off. Not to mention the community is worse off because they don't have those goods and services anymore. And the idea that low-skilled workers don't negotiate just simply isn't true. I've done that myself as a low-skilled worker. Going into a minimum wage, I haggled to be paid more than minimum wage when I was in high school working for a pizza parlor. I did that just recently, my last job. When I was been unemployed for a while, he had plenty of. Go ahead and pass this mic back if you don't mind. Appreciate it. I was unemployed earlier this year, and I can only imagine how much more difficult it would be if they set some minimum wage for my industry. It'd probably be a lot harder if it was higher than what I ended up being worth. But I was unemployed for a while, so he he had the leverage, and I was still able to negotiate about $4,000 more than he offered me. And I know I'm not low skilled anymore, but like I said, even in high school, I was negotiating uh, higher rates than the minimum wage. So that's simply not true that they don't negotiate. You can negotiate. Um, And you can negotiate much more effectively with low unemployment because there's less people unemployed to take your place. So people like Qatar, who's got like a 0.4% unemployment rate, they have no minimum wage. Places like Singapore, no minimum wage. I think they top like 3% in the Great Recession. These people aren't replaceable by unemployed people, so they actually have more bargaining power in that case. You mentioned how you work in reality, and that's I'm working in reality too. I know people say everybody says that for their argument, so I don't think that's worth responding to. You already gave me a favor, so I'm gonna go ahead and pass it back.
Okay, I just want to touch back on my point I was saying. If let's look at your video store. I don't know, maybe your video store is one of the few left in the country that are still open. But when the community doesn't spend money in your shop, it doesn't make sense to hire people to work for less money in order to keep them open, or to keep them open when obviously that money is not being spent in your, especially if you're talking about having to go around very low, or to find people that are ineligible to work. You can't afford. You shouldn't be open. You most certainly, I assume, are a middle schooler. You should middle school labor in order to keep your door open. If you the minimum wage, I think it's good that you were. And I say is what's on for most in a lot uh, experience versus your position has a set wage, and that's just what the point is. You the minimum wage, there are certain areas where the minimum wage should be higher to calculate based on any certain metric, but I do, if you agree, can then take, say, different minimum that qualifies. I think the minimum wage here in see where I am is definitely should across the board, and they would not a mess, but I'm sure that they could come up with one way to buy themselves job food. So, and we know that the more money that people have in their pockets, the more money that they're willing to spend. Most people spend all the money that they have. So by setting the minimum wage higher, more people would spend their money in different locations, which means that more businesses would open. If more people have money to spend, more businesses open because there are more people to spend money in those businesses. So by increasing the minimum wage, you would actually seek to, or you actually go about increasing competition and lowering prices because you'll now have businesses opening.
I think job growth is more important than consumer spending. I think any benefits you get from consumer spending will be counteracted and probably outweighed by the downside to employment growth. I mentioned how you said you're working in reality last time. I wrote that down, but I forgot what I was actually going to say. I think it's because you said you like to talk about what's actually happening, and I mentioned this earlier, but what I said earlier about making a $7 an hour job illegal is actually what's happening. That like take away all the nonsense, and that's what's happening. You have two people, they come into an agreement, and completely benevolent, peaceful, and the government says you can't do that. And I have yet to hear your response on why something so harmless should be illegal. You keep saying you can set prices, but in the Soviet Union, of course, we all know that the communism collapsed in the Soviet Union, but they were actually looking at the prices of capitalist countries to know how to set their prices in the Soviet Union, because, like I said, there's no way you can substitute for the collective decision making of millions of people operating in a market. And like I said, even if you can find, even if you can get close, like I said, my expenses are probably way different than your expenses. Um, there's just no way to account for those types of things with one policy. And really, like I already mentioned, abolishing the federal minimum wage isn't even going to probably make a difference. It's just pushing it back to the states, and they take care of that anyways. I actually talked to. I haven't talked much about the consumer side of this. I actually talked to an employer who told me she didn't care what the minimum wage was. She was gonna charge whatever she had to charge, even that meant charging $50 a gallon for gas. She owned a chain of gas stations, and so whenever you have raised the cost of producing a good or service, and it's going to push up prices, so you're literally helping like 5% of workers at the expense of everybody, because we're not all workers. We're definitely not all low-skilled workers, but we're all consumers. So you're helping a very, very small portion of people at the expense of everybody else. And that's why even if you try to use the general welfare clause of the Constitution, it doesn't work, because it's not general welfare. It's for a very small group of people. So you're helping a small group of people at the expense of everybody else.
Okay. So I'm going to tackle your attempt, your idea that why can't two individuals an agreement to for 7 should be legal. I'm going to use another analogy, if you'll forgive my use of them. Would you allow an individual to negotiate with a lawyer in order to come to what's going to be their best their sentence, or their best fine that they're going to have to pay? No, of course not. You would not have an individual who lacks, especially if we're talking about unskilled workers who this is their first job. It seems to me, even if that unskilled worker is as an adult, to have them go into their first job or their an unskilled job, to have them sit down with an HR whose job it is to get the lowest pay possible, and think that those individuals can come to a reasonable agreement that is going to be beneficial and acceptable for both of them. If you think that the person whose job it is to get the employee hired at the cheapest amount is going to not take advantage of someone who does not have the experience, who is unskilled, who does not have the I don't want to say the education in every case, but who does not have the life experiences in order to negotiate correctly, in order to take care of what's them, who does not know what they need, who say they're just starting out and they think, oh, yes, I'm just starting out I graduated high school, I'm starting out on my whole life. I can make it with a $7 an hour wage. I can fend for myself. Well, no, we know that they're over the course of the next year or the course of the next 2 years, real life is going to catch up with them. They're going to have an apartment. They're going to have gas. They're going to have food. When they're negotiating for their first job as unskilled workers, they don't know what their expenses are going to be. They just simply lack the knowledge. So it seems to me that to say that just because someone happens to be an adult, that they have all the necessary knowledge to make a decision on whether or not someone who is trying to get them for less than their worth, if they're going to, I mean, it seems to me odd to say that someone is going to know my time is worth X. I know that. Of course, they're not going to know that because they don't know what it's going to be. They don't know what the going wages are. So my idea to respond to yours is the reason that we don't allow adults as you say, to negotiate and come up to agree to work for $7 an hour is because those negotiations are never fair. It's never two people who have the same background, who have the same knowledge. Always.
Were you done there? Thumbs up if you want. Okay. Sorry. You're talking about negotiating. Okay, so people may not know what they're worth, but I can tell you they they know a hell of a lot more than some faceless bureaucrat in Washington. They know a lot more than that person on what they need, and that's the whole point of individual freedom. Nobody knows more about what's best for our life than us. And that's not saying we know it all, but we certainly know more than anybody else on earth, really, probably, unless maybe our parents or something like that, but definitely not a bureaucrat. So, and it's simply not true that these negotiations are always unfair. So, the lady that owns a chain of gas station stores, they were hiring, and I got to see a lot of the. I did a 6-month contract with them, so I saw a lot of the applications coming in, and I feel like most of the people were asking for minimum wage, and they really don't even pay attention to that. Everybody gets started at $9 an hour. So there, you have someone paying more than minimum wage. So that contradicts your claims that they'll pay the lowest. They're already paying more than minimum wage, more than they're required to pay, and two, they're paying more than that person's even asking for. So it's just not true that they're always going to pay the minimum, and it's always going to be unfair. Lots of times when people get jobs, they sometimes they're overpaid. I mean, in high school, I worked a lot of fast food jobs, and I had money coming out of my ears. I can't imagine what it would be like if it was like, the fight for 15. If they had their way, and I was making $15 an hour, I literally wouldn't know what to do with all my money. But what's more likely is I probably wouldn't have a job at that point. And I don't think you've really addressed that part of the argument of its effect on unemployment, because I think that's a big case that you need to answer.
All right, and I assume when you say the case for unemployment, you're talking about strictly youth unemployment, right? That if they increase the minimum wage, and you're going to have older people staying in what are thought of as starter jobs or first jobs much longer because they can afford to provide for their family based on those criteria. I mean, based on the minimum wage that they have, they won't need to seek higher paying employment when they have families because they'll already be making enough to afford them. So we recognize that there are certain jobs that people who have lower responsibilities, students, high school students, brand new people with no families, gravitate to because they're lower wages. They're don't require any initial experience. So we recognize that if those jobs were paid more, people would stay in them longer because they wouldn't have to seek employment elsewhere. So we know that you're going to make the argument that those individuals will not, that the youth is going to be unemployed more. Now, to me, it seems to follow that if individuals are able to provide better for their family and stay in those jobs and have secure amounts of money, then their children are going to be in a better position, which means that the children are going to be able to have more opportunities. They're going to be able to go to school more. Parents who make $15 an hour as opposed to $7 an hour or $7.25 or $8 or $9 an hour. If the minimum wage was 15, they're going to be able to afford better housing. They're going to be able to send their kids to school. The kids are going to be able to afford to go to college. It's going to change their environment. Giving people money that helps them live, so they're not struggling to eat, that they're not struggling to provide for their family, to give their family health care. It seems to me that it would only benefit the kids. So when you're talking about is now we're going to have a higher rate of unemployment, well, because more people are going to be making more money and staying in certain jobs longer. I'm not sure that I see how that's going to lead to higher youth unemployment if you consider that more youth is going to be going to school. I mean, that just seems like a natural progression. It could be that I'm completely off base, that parents with more money have children who go to school less often, but I don't think that correlates. As far as I understand it, the better off financially that parents are, the more likely it is that their children will go to school beyond high school. So my response to that the minimum wage or increasing minimum wage will increase unemployment is just simply, I don't think that to be the case. And if it is, the only people that would be most affected are going to be the children, but the children are going to be educating themselves to move into jobs, to get the education to move them into jobs, but other than those starter jobs that their parents are working at.
It's not just youth that gets affected by unemployment laws. That homeless guy I was talking to definitely wasn't a youth. It could be anybody with any low skill of any age. And minimum wage, we're not talking about secure jobs here. We're talking about minimum wage. You can't raise your kids, send them to college on even $15 an hour, much less $7.25. So that's not going to have the effect you're talking about. And if you were to get the minimum wage up to those levels where it is enough to be secure, like you described, well, at that point, it's going to cause enough inflation where you will no longer be able to afford these things that you're talking about. When we talk about going to college, most of the workers at college are work-study kids, and they always make the minimum wage no matter what. So you're already raising the price of college, and that's already going to be more expensive under that paradigm. I have, I have 4 minutes, not 20 seconds. Yeah, so it's not just youth, and it's not, and this is like basic, this is basic economics. I mean, the demand slope, it slopes down. So like, if you raise the price of something, people are going to buy less of it. I mean, labor is no different. So it definitely causes unemployment, or at least less growth of employment. The argument was just like how much. So even liberal economists concede that it hurts employment, but they argue that the benefits outweigh it. So there will be, it doesn't definitely affect employment. I mean, it has to. It's just economic laws at play. Like there's no way it can't. So I think I'm going to go ahead and pass that back.
Okay, when you're talking about it's going to affect employment, it seems to me that if a business needs 50 employees to run, that even when you increase the minimum wage, if the business needs exactly 50 employees to run, it's going to have exactly 50 employees working at it. I mean, we know from experience, we know from the modern world, and we can look around that companies that have thousands of people working for them, they could afford to pay their employees more. And sometimes they do, like you said, your chain of gas stations, they pay them $9 an hour. It's most certainly there are companies that would pay those same employees $7.25 an hour. They need the same number of employees. That chain of companies have decided to pay them more, taking a cut in profits. There's also companies that do not pay them more, and so they increase in profits. So the idea is, yes, if we're going to say that companies if you're concerned solely with the profit of the company, and the idea that if a company is going to lose a margin of their profit in order to pay their employees more, and it seems to me unlikely that most companies, especially if they were to raise the minimum wage to $9, the company that you talked about would have no change. It's not like they're going to start paying their employees now $11 an hour and cutting their prices, so nothing would change for them. So when you're saying that you're going to lose employees, I mean, I own a business myself. I have to have X number of employees working. If they raise the minimum wage, I don't pay my employees the minimum wage. Of course, I pay them higher than the minimum wage. But if they were to raise it above to where I'm paying them, then I would simply pay them that, and then there'd just be less left over. But it would cut into my profits, but it wouldn't make my company fail. And so the idea that companies are going to fail because they're going to a $2 an hour raise or a $5 an hour raise for their employees is going to be so devastating that certain companies are going to not be able to afford to hire the same amount of people that they need to function just is I think absurd. Employees today are super productive. I mean, the same employee, I mean, what is it they say that we're at the lowest wage since the 1950s or 1960s based on productivities by the individual versus what the minimum wage is. So the idea that these companies are going to make less profit is going to mean that they're going to lay off individuals or close down I'm just simply sure that, yes, there's going to be a percentage that close down, but in the majority are just going to pay it.
You said that people that pay $7.50 an hour or pay the minimum wage will have more profits, and people that pay above the minimum wage would have less profits. But that's not necessarily true. So companies that pay more do so for good reason. I mean, they're not just benevolent beings. That paying higher wages keeps your employees longer. Turnover is very expensive for a company. So employees that pay higher wages, they have happier employees, which make more productive employees. They keep them around for longer, so they save money on turnover. So it's not true that they're going to cut into their profits. They could have them make more profits. But I guess that answers one of the first questions I asked you: is where do you think this money would come out of? And I guess the answer is profits. Now, if you're not making, if it's cutting your profits and you're no longer making a profit, you're losing your incentive to operate that business. So so when you lose the incentive because you're not making profits, you're either going to close down or you're going to move your business, I don't know, to a place with better, less regulations or whatever. So that's where the loss of employment comes in.
Okay. You're not going to lose the incentive to operate the business, because if we're talking about a global hike in the minimum wage, then that means your business and your community, all of a sudden, everyone that works for minimum wage or a little bit higher has just gotten a raise, which means that all those people now have more money, which means that if your business is a viable business in the community, then you're going to have an increase in people coming in to buy your product. I mean, it's just simply the case that if people have money, they spend money. I mean, that's a can you say that's an economic axiom? I don't know. If people have the money, they're going to spend it. Most people spend all the money that they have. So you're not going to lose incentive to operate the business because you're going to have more people purchasing the business. And it seems to me to be fairly obvious that you have to protect the employees.
Well, it's absolutely true that this. I mean, I can send you. I can post a link where lots of stories of companies, like I said, in California, that are closing down largely because of the minimum wage. So it does happen where they lose their profits, and they close down when their customers are happy, their employees are happy, and they close down because they're just not making money anymore. So that absolutely happens, and I can post a link after the debate. So you're out. I got a minute and 20 seconds. So I guess I'll do my closing remarks. Just to recap my arguments, there's no authority in the Constitution for the minimum wage. Like I said, it's against the General Welfare Clause, because it's not for everybody's general welfare. It's just for a few people's. So you gave no argument for the Constitution besides it exists, which obviously isn't a good argument for it being constitutional. You had no argument for it not losing employment. And you had no argument for why it's wrong for two people to agree to work for a wage, which happens all the time off the books with no problem. So these arguments, I believe, stood. There is nothing wrong with somebody agreeing to pay a wage, even though they don't have all the information about what they're worth. They know more than the argument you said for why they can't make these negotiations could be the same argument you can make for the bureaucrats making these decisions for them. So I just believe that the argument is somewhat pretty arrogant to think that we know more than what's good for somebody than they know themselves. And so it's been fun. Thanks for engaging, and down with the minimum wage. I'm just gonna let this run out.